In this video, I will begin to introduce some of the concepts of layering. I'll cover them in more depth later, but this is just an early introduction. This example is based on a discussion in Martin Fowler's book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. Now, imagine you're creating a web application that tracks sales at a cafe. You separated the HTML code from the Java code using the Model 2 architecture. But is this enough? Is your design perfect as soon as you've separated the Java from the HTML? Well, obviously no. No design is perfect. But can we improve the design? To answer this, I'd like to think about why we separated the Java and the HTML. Well, I wanted to improve the separation between the user interface code and the underlying application logic. User interface technologies change over time. Today, I might be using Java Server Pages. Next week, I could be using Java Server Faces. The week after that, I might create an Android app or a web service or even a console application. I shouldn't have to rewrite the entire application when the user interface changes. By separating the user interface from the rest of the application, it's easier to evolve the system and even allow more than one user interface for the same application. Even if I don't change the user interface technology, there is still value in separating the user interface code for maintainability. If your user interface is separate from the application logic, it becomes easy to maintain, debug, and test your code in isolation. So, returning to the example. Suppose we have a report of monthly sales. And if the sales have increased by 10% or more, then that line should be highlighted in red. Now, it would be tempting to just put it in the user interface. For each line, check if the difference is larger than 10%, and then set the color accordingly. But do you think this is part of the user interface? Or is it part of your business logic? How would you split up the functionality? The general rule of thumb is to ask whether you would duplicate any of the code if you were to use a radically different user interface, like a console application. Now, obviously colors can't be shown in a black and white console application, so that suggests it isn't user interface. But if we did have a console application, we would expect those lines to be highlighted in some other way, so perhaps there is some reuse. Let me read what Fowler says. The developers place logic in the presentation layer that compared this month's sales to last month's sales, and if the difference was more than 10%, they set the color to red. The trouble is that that's putting domain logic into the presentation. To properly separate the layers, you need a method in the domain layer to indicate if a product has improving sales. This method does a comparison between the 2 months and returns a Boolean value. The presentation layer then simply calls this Boolean method and, if true, highlights the product in red. That way the process is broken into its 2 parts, deciding whether there is something highlightable and choosing how to highlight. He goes on, I'm uneasy being overly dogmatic about this. When reviewing this book, Alan Knight commented that he was torn between whether just putting that into the UI is the first step on a slippery slope to hell, or a perfectly reasonable thing that only a dogmatic purist would object to. The reason we are uneasy is because it's both. Throughout this subject, you will be making difficult design decisions. There's often no clear answer. Even if one design seems obviously better, you might make a pragmatic decision to do something else. As you work through this subject, I'd like you to obsess about details. This subject is an excellent opportunity for you to experiment with different ideas. If you're unsure about a design, try a few different approaches and see which one you like the most. Once you've made a decision, stop and ask yourself why you made the decision and under what situations you might change your decision.